Hello everybody and welcome. Today we're going to look at trade. Specifically, we're going to be looking at absolute advantage and comparative advantage and how that might increase the terms of trade and why it would benefit for countries to trade with one another, even though it may not seem obvious in the first place. The first concept we're going to look at here is absolute advantage, and this is the ability of a country to produce more of a good or service than someone else in the same amount of time. For example, if you're thinking of oil production due to the ease of producing oil and getting it out of the ground, Saudi Arabia has an absolute advantage in oil production compared to any other country. For them, they can produce more oil and can produce oil with less effort. Michael Jordan, back in the 90s, had an absolute advantage in basketball, or at least in the ability to slam dunk. And so no one else could play as well as he could. If we look at the table down here, which is what we're going to look at for the next couple of slides, we have Mexico and the United States looking at two specific products, that of avocados and that of soybeans. And when you're looking at advantage here, it really takes place to look at the two extremes. And so if we look at avocados, Mexico, for example, is able to grow 60 avocados, whereas the United States is able to grow 90 avocados. The United States obviously has an absolute advantage in avocado production. On the other hand, if we look at soybeans, Mexico can produce 15 soybeans, while the United States can produce 30, which means the United States also has an absolute advantage in soybeans. So while you might say now, why would the U.S. ever want to trade with Mexico? What's the benefit for them there? There actually is a benefit, and that's what we're going to get to in the next slide. So the next concept here is comparative advantage. While some countries might have an absolute advantage in what they can totally produce, a comparative advantage means that you can produce something at a lower opportunity cost. So for the United States, while they might be able to produce more avocados and soybeans, what are they giving up? China, in the example above, has a comparative advantage in textile production. They can produce more textiles than the United States can comparatively. That doesn't mean that China can produce more textiles overall. If the United States put all of its resources towards producing textiles, shirts, and clothing, the United States might be able to produce more than China. But the United States also would risk giving up more. The opportunity cost would be greater for the United States to focus on producing textiles than it would be for China. So let's once again look here and think about how we would look at the comparative advantage. When you're looking at the comparative advantage, you once again really only want to focus on the two extremes. And so in the case of Mexico, they could produce either 60 avocados or 15 soybeans. And so, whereas the United States, for example, producing 90 or 30. Now, if they were just producing it by themselves, keep in mind, they might be looking back on what is in the middle. So the United States might, if they want a bit of both and they're not trading, produce 33 avocados and 19 soybeans. And Mexico would produce 24 avocados and 9 soybeans. If you add all this up, it means if the countries just produced for themselves, you would end up with 57 avocados, and you would end up with 19 plus 9, 27 soybeans. So overall, both countries could produce 57 and could produce 27. But since we only want to focus on the extremes here, let's go to the next slide. When we look at the extremes, what you're looking at here with absolute advantage is the opportunity cost. Comparative advantage. So for the United States, if they make 90 avocados, they give up 30 soybeans. So if that's so they give up 3 for every 9, that would equal 1/3 for their opportunity cost for avocados. If you look at soybeans, for every 3 soybeans they grow, they give up 9 avocados. The opportunity cost is 9 avocados per 3 soybeans, or an opportunity cost of 3. if you look at Mexico, on the other hand, for every 60 avocados they grow, they would give up 15 soybeans, which ends up being a 1/4. So they give up a fourth of soybeans for every avocado they choose to grow. However, if they go with soybeans, they end up doing the opposite, and I'm sure you can see the pattern that's emerging here. They would give up 4 avocados for every soybean that they would choose to go into and choose to grow. Which means you go with the country who would end up with the lowest opportunity cost. If you look at avocados, the lowest opportunity cost would be Mexico, growing 60. Soybeans, the lowest opportunity cost would be the US, growing 30. So you would end up that Mexico would specialize their production in avocados, whereas the United States would specialize their production in soybeans. Overall, world between the two countries, now that they're trading, they would produce 60 and 30, as opposed to, if we go back to the slide before, just 57 and 27. So overall, both countries are better off with what they have available to them, even though the U.S. is growing fewer avocados than, or the U.S. is getting fewer avocados than Mexico than they could grow independently. They're better off with both soybeans and avocados together. Now, this is what we would consider an output problem. An output problem means how much can it produce? And this is where it gets tricky. Is it an output problem or is it an input problem? The avocados and the soybeans would be an output problem, the number that you're able to produce. When you're looking at output, you want to maximize output, produce as much as is possible. An input problem, on the other hand, can get a bit trickier because what it's looking at is how much labor would go into producing one unit. If you want to produce more units, you want to minimize your labor, your land, your capital, your entrepreneurship. So by limiting those inputs, you want to minimize it. And that's how you go into. So let's take a peek at an input problem. So if we were looking at the countries of Estonia and Venia, they are creating stuff and they are creating nonsense. This means for Estonia, they are able, it takes 20, let's say in this case, hours to produce one stuff. For Venia, it creates 40 hours to produce a stuff. Venia spends 50 hours to produce nonsense, whereas Estonia would have 10 hours to produce nonsense. Once again, it would appear in both of these, Estonia has an absolute advantage. It takes Estonia less time, less labor, less inputs to be able to put into creating both stuff and nonsense. So what is the benefit of being able to trade with Venia? Well, you once again want to look at the absolute advantage. Sorry, at the opportunity cost and the comparative advantage here. So you're asking what you give up. So if Estonia can produce one of something in 20 hours, but it's only 10 hours to produce one nonsense, that means for every one stuff they produce, they give up 2 nonsense. That is their opportunity cost. Whereas in 10 hours of producing nonsense, you could produce 1/2 of a stuff. For Venia, if they are looking at producing at 40 hours spent producing stuff, in that time, they could produce 4/5 of a stuff. In the 50 hours to produce nonsense, they could produce 5/4. So once again, you want to figure out how can you make the most stuff and the most nonsense. How would you trade this? Once again, because we looked at how much you're able to produce and we turned it on its head, you want to minimize the input. So in both of these, the opportunity cost of the input would mean we would end up getting 40 stuff from Venia and 10 nonsense. Or we would go towards Venia to produce stuff, 40 hours to produce one stuff, and Estonia to produce nonsense, 10 hours to produce one nonsense. These are their comparative advantages in each in creating the labor. Now there is a shortcut. And so we'll look at this for a second because it's always helpful to know what a shortcut is. This is looking at Australia and Brazil, sleds, and clarinets. you could once again calculate the opportunity cost working through there piece by piece, but you can also produce it by cross-multiplying. And so if you cross-multiply 300 and 1, you end up with, if that combination, it's 300. If you cross-multiply 200 and 2, you'd end up with 400. Now, since we're looking at how many sleds you can create, not how many hours go into the sled, this is an output problem. And in an output problem, you want to maximize outputs. So if our total output is 300 for one combination, or 400 in the other combination, you want to go with the one with the larger combination. You will have Brazil produce 200 sleds, and Australia produce 2 clarinets in this case. We can also go back and apply this to the question before, looking at Stonia and Veria, our input problem. If you cross-multiply Stonia and Veria, 20 and 50 would give you 1,000, whereas cross-multiplying the 40 and the 10 would only give you 400. Since this is an input problem, this is multiplying the total value of the inputs. And the goal is to minimize the inputs. Therefore, we want to go with the one that spends the least amount of the inputs. Just like before, Venia would produce stuff, and Stonia would produce nonsense. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.